Welcome, everyone. We are excited to talk to you today. Thank you all for joining us. Our learning objectives for today, we're hoping by the end of today's session, you'll be able to provide at least 3 examples of required HealthLink documentation for research participants, at least 2 examples of optional documentation, and at least 1 example of prohibited documentation for research participants, as well as describe 1 impact of the Cures Act final rule on patient access to information sharing. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit more as well. So here's our agenda. We'll say hi, we'll introduce ourselves so you know who we are and where we're coming from and why we're talking with you about this today. We'll get a little bit into why do we document in the electronic health record and what is HealthLink. And then we'll spend most of our time on the guidelines for required documentation in HealthLink. You don't have to feverishly take notes. There's a nice document that we'll refer to that provides all this information, but this can be a nice way to discuss it in a different way. And then there's a final little bonus content in the end about the Cures Act final rule and sort of how that plays with the documentation we're entering into the health record and then what gets released to the patient. So with that, let's get started. So a little bit about us. I'm going to let Carla introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Carla Croft. I have 11 years experience as a clinical research nurse. The vast majority of those were on the clinical research unit, working both directly with patients and also transitioning into protocol implementation. And I have been in this role supporting research users in HealthLink for almost 2 years now. We're coming up on. Anne?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ann Beeben, and I too worked on the clinical research unit for about 5 years as a clinical research nurse, caring for research participants. I then moved into a role like more general nursing informatics role, and then switched, like Carla said, into this role. Isn't it almost 3 years now? Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh my gosh, Anne, you're
Right?
right. You're right. It has been almost 3
Just
years.
flying by. So again, we are all about the care of research participants and all the different aspects as well that where informatics can play a role in supporting that care. So just to kind of frame up the conversation here, we first wanted to just touch on why do we even document in the electronic health record? I know that seems like a really basic question, but I think it's important to just think about that for a moment as we move forward, as we get into the guidance for the other requirements and whatnot. So there's some characteristics of an electronic health record that are important and helpful in supporting safe and effective patient care. The fact that it's real time, again, it's intended to be designed to be patient-centered. Whether or not that's always the case, maybe it could be under debate, but that is the goal. Really trying to get the medical and treatment history of the patient available to the entire care and treatment team. And can go beyond standard clinical data and include just a broader view of that patient's care as a whole person. It does really more than replace the paper charts that we're using up until about 10 years ago, because it enables us to do some extra things that are also really, again, effective in supporting the effective care of patients and safety. Sharing information is getting better and better. We still have a ways to go in some of our, sharing of data, especially across different sites, as I'm sure you're all aware. But this is getting better all the time thanks to the electronic health record, really streamlining collaboration between different teams to support the patient's care. It also decision support tools that we can build into the electronic health record, really, again, support effective decision making by our care team members, as well as help us to provide more standardized evidence-based care so that all of our patients hopefully are getting the best of the best care in a standardized way. It can also enable us to automate some clinician workflows, hopefully letting the computer do some of that tasky stuff so that ultimately, I think what we all want, those of us that interact with patients and participants, is to have a chance to spend more time with them and not doing, menial tasky things. So a lot of benefits of the electronic health record. Again, in the broad scheme of things, really the goal is to support patient care that is effective and safe. So that's kind of the core of what we'll be talking about and carrying through as we go forward to talk about the more specific guidelines. Of course, there's some patient care adjacent workflows that are important for the EHR as well. There's operations, reimbursement. Unfortunately, healthcare is not free. Compliance considerations, risk management. Carl and I are both nurses, and there's sort of this mantra: if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So there's definitely some, other things that we consider outside of the care of the patient that are also important for documentation purposes. So just kind of center us all on that. We just wanted to start there. And there's a little reference here to healthit.gov if you want to check it out. That gets more into like the history of the EHR and what it's all about. So what's HealthLink? So again, if you're in a space where you're not using these tools yet, again, many of you may be, but just because the terminology can kind of get sort of interchangeable. So HealthLink is UW Health's version of our electronic health record, and it's the software we use. Epic is the vendor that provides us with that software. So sometimes you can hear these get used interchangeably. So if that's ever been confusing to you, just know that that's the distinction. But essentially, HealthLink is our organization at UW Health, our electronic health record software. And again, in terms of defining kind of what that means in terms of what data is included in the electronic health record, basically anything documented in HealthLink is considered a part of the patient's electronic health record. There's a lot more detailed information about that in this policy that we're referencing here, 6.38, that you can check out. We'll do a little bit of this at the end in the context of the Cures Act discussion, but probably a little more detail than we can get into for this presentation. Carla, was there anything more that you wanted to add here about the content of this policy?
Nope. The policy really spells out exactly what it is. This bullet is just the distillation of it. So anything that is in HealthLink is part of the patient's electronic health record.
So keeping that in mind. All right, so we're going to jump into the guidelines for required documentation in HealthLink that are related to research. So again, don't feel like you have to feverishly take notes. There is a document, if you haven't seen it yet, out on UConnect all about this, and it is entitled HealthLink Guidance Document, Documentation of Clinical Research Related Care. We've linked it here in the slides, which will go out. If you lose track of this presentation and you're wondering, how do I find this in the future? We have a whole UConnect page. If you just type in research in UConnect, you will land there. We are #1, very proud of that. And this resource is right along the top in our kind of, general core resources section. So just know that you can find it again if you've, lose track of today's presentation. So all the information that we're going to talk about is in there, plus some extra details, but we'll try to give you some of the highlights just so we can provide some examples and sort of talk this through. And then who does this information apply to? We'll kind of frame that up too here before we get into the details. So this is for research staff interacting within the UW affiliated covered entity. And again, if you don't know what that means, we don't really have time to get into that big list today. But if you're not sure if you are in that entity within your research group or whatever group you're working in, we've provided the link to the policy here, UW 101, and you can kind of check that out. So it's staff interacting within that UW affiliated covered entity with research participants within UW Health. So again, note that UW Health staff will always follow UW Health documentation requirements for all patients, including research participants. So if they're caring for a patient who happens to be a research participant as well, they are going to follow all the UW Health documentation requirements and policies for documentation. Okay, and the exceptions. So exceptions are interactions taking place within with research staff in a research space, so not UW Health space. So if your team happens to have a few of their own offices where you might meet with participants, then that would be sort of what we'd consider a research space. And then you know, some of these documentation guidelines and requirements wouldn't be needed if there is no potential impact to clinical care. So let's say, again, this is an example, the patient meets with you in your research space office and they're filling out some questionnaires about, you know, things about their life and quality of life or something. And in that respect, like for that type of visit, you wouldn't be expected to follow the documentation guidelines that we'll be talking about shortly. Exceptions, at least for now, are also research staff at Northern Illinois, formerly known as Swedish American, and UW Health Care Direct, formerly Chartwell. So these are entities that are kind of coming into the fold at UW Health. But for the time being, at least, these guidelines that we're going to talk about today don't pertain to those groups. All right. So again, guiding principles, sort of broad brushstrokes here. If the information that could in any way potentially impact a participant's clinical care, it should be documented in HealthLink. So that is sort of your rule of thumb. And sometimes this is more obvious than other times. You know, obvious examples are if somebody received a medication, an invasive procedure took place. Some of those less obvious examples are, you know, maybe an imaging study, but it involved contrast, abnormal vital signs, and things like that. So, you know, if you're ever unsure about that, we encourage research coordinators to always consult with their PI and or the, you know, the clinical team members that are working with their research team to kind of talk this through, kind of what would fit in with the type of data that is going to, you know, be important for clinical care and getting that entered in. Other research information is allowed to be put in if it won't be detrimental to the patient. And we're going to get into this in a little bit. Won't get into detail here just yet, but we'll cover that exception as well. Interventional research studies. So the guidance document that I referred to before states that this only applies to documentation of interventional research studies that could have an impact on the participant's clinical care, such as a medical intervention, radiology testing with contrast. So I guess the reason we wanted to bring up this slide is because, as you know, many of you know, there's different types of studies, and these can be defined differently by, you know, kind of different groups of researchers. You know, some common buckets can be interventional, observational, registry studies are, you know, kind of three types of studies that we often see. But just because there isn't a research intervention, so interventional in that sense, in terms of the research, a study can have procedures that are clinical interventions. So this is just sort of the distinction we want to make. So for example, there's an encore definition now in the KB of non-intervention studies that have clinical interventions or procedures. So again, just to keep in mind that this isn't just for research interventional studies, but can also apply to observational studies that might have clinical interventions or procedures occurring. So we gave some examples here. There might be an observational study, for example, that does a screening study with a lumbar puncture. So there's that lumbar puncture procedure that is clinically relevant. Or a biospecimen repository study, you know, maybe they collect skin punch biopsies. And the fact that that person got a biopsy could be clinically relevant. So just to provide those examples and kind of that nuance of what we mean by interventional. So in general, we would just recommend taking a liberal approach if activities could potentially impact clinical care, do document it in HealthLink. Okay, so we're going to start with what must be documented in HealthLink. Again, just to kind of ensure patient safety and the best care of the patient. So the research-informed consent, our guiding principle here is if there's anything documented in HealthLink about the study, the consent should be uploaded so that all care team members can access it and then know then a little bit about what that study's about. As you all know, those consent forms are a great resource, obviously for the patient, but even for like a clinical team member who might want to know a little bit about what the study's about. They don't need to read an 80-page protocol, but just having the consent in the record can help them review that quickly and just kind of get an idea what the study's about. And that might help if there's anything that comes up with that patient. So examples of the documentation that might be in the record where you would want to make sure that that consent form is then paired up in the record for that patient is, documentation for the study, be it in notes or whatnot, the creation of encounters that were created for research purposes or by research team members, any orders that were placed for the research study, or even the fact that the study is interfaced from Encore and displays in the patient's research studies activity. So those are just a couple examples, not all inclusive. But again, if there's things in there about things in the electronic health record going on, documentation about the study, we would want the whole care team to be able to reference the consent form if needed and know a little bit about what that study's about and just make sure that those that supporting consent form is in the record. The copy of the signed consent and the study HIPAA authorization should be uploaded into HealthLink. We do have a resource about this, about how you can use CloudFax to do that. Pretty slick workflow. So if you haven't known about that workflow before, we've included it here, and there's a resource that you can see linked below where you can check that out. And then one other thing to note is that when a consent is obtained during a patient care encounter, a note must be entered in the HealthLink encounter where that occurred. And you can see UConnect resource on note templates and the selection of appropriate note types. We've linked that in here too, just because you have a couple of options there, so you can kind of think through which is the best fit, depending on what was discussed during that encounter. So just know that if the consent took place during a patient care encounter, you're going to want to write a note as well as uploading the consent. Okay, and then the next piece of required documentation is the research diagnosis code on the problem list, so the Z00.6. This ensures that patients' study participation is documented in HealthLink, irregardless of if the study is interfaced with Encore or not. So as many of you on the call might know, if Encore is our clinical trials management system, and we're lucky here that that can then interface with HealthLink and provide some of the patient and study association information, bring that from Encore into HealthLink. But not all studies use Encore and can do that. So this workflow ensures that we have consistent documentation on the problem list of all patients' participations in research. So you can see an example here of this being added within the electronic health record into HealthLink, and then sort of our standard smart phrase template, sort of filled in with funny data here for the ABC research study, but just the kind of information that would be expected. The name of the study, very quick, brief overview of what the study is about, and roughly how long you would expect that to be there. And then research teams can resolve this in the future when the patient is done with the study. So the next piece of required documentation is the clinically significant test or procedure results. So this is only required if results are considered clinically significant for that patient. Again, this is likely a judgment call by the provider, the clinical team working with your study, or the PI. This should only be done, though, if the results are from a CLIA certified lab. So CLIA is Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, but it's a lab certification, or if the device that the results came from is FDA approved for diagnosis. So do keep those things in mind in terms of whether or not it's appropriate for those results to go into the electronic health record. And this information may be manually entered into a progress note, or the document that has the results could be scanned into HealthLink. So there's a couple of options there. Next, we'll get into investigational products and the medication list. So again, another piece of required documentation. All patients in the electronic record have a medication list of the meds that they're reporting that they're taking at home, as well as anything that was prescribed by providers within the UW Health system, et cetera. And then if there's an investigational product that's part of the study, that should make the research team should make sure that that gets added to the medication list. And that is irregardless of where that administration occurs. And this is just showing a screenshot about how that would be done. And we're using here the investigational drug kind of generic version, but your study might have its very own study med record with your study ID and IRB number, et cetera, in that medication name that you would select to add here.
I was actually going to jump in, Ann, and say,
Yeah.
I used the investigational drug here as a screenshot. You should not do that unless you absolutely have to. If your study involves an investigational product, please reach out to PRC about getting a medication record created in HealthLink for your study, even if there's not orders for your study, so that you can document the exact drug the patient is getting on their medication list. That is also in the HealthLink guidance document and linked to earlier in the presentation.
Perfect. Yes. So this is for instructional purposes only. Do reach out to that pharmaceutical research center if your study involves a medication, and they'll get that billed for you, so you can get the real medication for the patient there. All right. Another topic is investigational product administration. So this one's a little bit busy, but we'll walk you through it here. So if that administration of that investigational product, let's say it's a medication, occurs during a clinical encounter, it may be administered by clinical staff, and then they would use their normal workflow along the top here of documenting that on the medication administration record, the MAR, if you've heard that term before. So we're going kind of down to the second option here. If during the clinical encounter it's administered by the research staff do not have the ability to document on the MAR. They are going to need to document that in a progress note and then communicate that to the clinical staff, who can then add it to the MAR on their behalf and like make a little note in there, like to see the progress note about the administration, for example, if they want to do that. But you kind of have to work in collaboration with your clinical staff to get that on the medication administration record if you're research staff administering that product. And then if it's occurring in a research encounter, again, research staff do not have access to the MAR, but they can document that in a progress note. And then we're just showing an example here of the MAR summary report, which kind of shows a summary of all the administrations that occurred during that patient encounter. All right, clinically significant information. So again, there's a wide range of possibilities of what this could mean. Ultimately, research staff should really consult with the principal investigator and or any sub-investigators that are, clinicians on their team to really, figure out within the context of your study and the patients who are participating in your study, what is clinically significant information. So I know that's kind of a gray area there, but again, we just really encourage that consultation with the providers who are working with your study. This could include findings outside of normal limits, or it could just include new findings that aren't already documented in the EHR. So again, this gets back to vital signs or patient-reported symptoms, or again, any number of things. It could include any procedures with potential clinical impact as well. So again, medications that are administered, imaging with contrast, because again, that's a new product going into the body, invasive procedures like lumbar punctures or bronchoscopies, maybe non-invasive procedures, but that might have risk of adverse events like an exercise stress test or a tilt table test or something that might, stress a patient to the point where, it could cause a physical change or a health change. So again, that's sort of the guideline, clinically significant information, but do consult as a team with the providers on your team in terms of, what that would be. All right, and next I'm going to hand it over to Carla to do the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Anne. So we're going to move on to what may be documented in HealthLink or optional documentation in HealthLink. And whether or not you include this depends a lot on your study, your patient population, what you're trying to accomplish with your documentation in HealthLink. So the first one I'm going to talk about is research notes. Anne had linked out to a resource earlier on her slide about consent documentation, which will take you to some guidance about note type selection and note contents. One of the note types we have available specifically for research is the research note type. This is for non-clinically significant research information to be documented. You can include things in these notes that is clinical. However, you want to make sure it is never the sole source of that documentation in the electronic health record. So for example, if you're writing about an adverse event that a patient has reported to you, you don't want it to only go into a research note. And this is where you're going to need to collaborate with the providers on the study and the clinicians on your study to make sure that they knew about this, it's documented potentially in their progress note or elsewhere in the patient's electronic health record. The primary purpose of this is really for research-specific documentation. So some examples are a consent discussion, if that takes place outside of patient care. Concomitant medication documentation is something else we allow to be put into research notes. Some teams have formatted specific SMART phrases that they might use to document this. Same thing with pill diaries, med counts, adverse events, or really anything that you're documenting just because of the research study, not because it's clinically significant. Again, like Anne had said earlier, if you have any questions about whether or not it's clinically significant, please consult with your principal investigator or the clinicians who are involved in your study. This next piece of what we're going to call optional documentation in HealthLink is pre-screen patient study association statuses. What this is really just a discrete way within HealthLink to document that a patient may or may not be potentially eligible for a study prior to them signing an informed consent form for the study. This link links out to the document and education we have about this on UConnect. And I have included a screenshot down here at the bottom that shows you what this looks like in a patient's research studies activity. But really, it's just a way for research staff to communicate both between each other, and this is also visible by clinical team members as well, that I've looked at this patient, they might be eligible for the study. I'm going to keep them on my list of potential subjects for this study. This is something that is only available right now for studies that are interfaced from Encore into HealthLink. You can go forward. Thank you, Anne, for running my slides, by the way. This next one is a little vague, so I might spend a little more time trying to explain what I'm trying to say here. And this is adding study details to order comments. So in the electronic health record, in healthcare in general, an order is a legal authorization by a doctor or other provider for other clinical team members to carry out specific assessments on a patient. So as a nurse, I don't have the authority myself to do certain activities with a patient unless a doctor gives me an order to do so. Things like giving a medication, doing certain assessments or tests with a patient. So orders are used to delegate that authority. Within HealthLink, we also leverage them as a communication tool for clinical staff. So they're used to communicate information either from a provider or one clinical team member to another clinical team member. We use this also for research. So as a way for research staff to communicate relevant information to clinical team members caring for patients who are working off of those orders within HealthLink. Some examples that tend to come up for research to clinical staff communication include things like putting a study title in the order comments, adding a subject ID number if a research kit needs to be labeled with that study ID number, adding contact information for the study coordinator if you want the clinical team to contact you for some reason. And putting that information in an order for clinical staff is a place they're used to seeing it, right? A lot of our clinical team members, particularly in inpatient settings, work very heavily off of those orders. So putting it in that place for them is a place they're used to going to find information. And so they may look there more frequently than if you're putting it in a note or in a sticky note specialty comment type location. These are under optional because this type of information is considered optional if you're entering your orders ad hoc. And what that means is if you're entering your orders one at a time, entering a list of labs to be drawn, entering a list of procedures the patient needs for a certain visit. When you use a research-specific order set or beacon treatment plan, this information is baked into those orders already. We include it by default in a lot of our research order sets, so they'll already have this type of information in it, but it's in this optional section because the vast majority of studies don't have research order sets or beacon treatment plans. You guys are just entering the orders that the patient needs at any given visit. And so it is optional for you to include this type of information in that type of order. And if you could move me forward. So this one I'm gonna highlight what's in parentheses first. At this time, this activity is only available for studies that are being run through Carbone Cancer Center. But HealthLink Epic does have the capability to have a discrete adverse event activity documentation. The reason right now that it is only rolled out for Carbone Cancer Center studies is because every time a study is using this activity, we have to define the entire term set for the study. And so cancer center studies, the vast majority of them all use the CTCAE as written. And therefore, we're able to provide support to that because we can enter one term set and all of their studies can use it. If we provided this to every single study, a lot of studies have study-specific adverse events. They have their own grading rules outside of CTCAE. And so that is why it hasn't been rolled out to everybody yet. Hopefully, maybe in the future, we will be able to do so, but unfortunately right now, it needs to stay contained. This documentation is considered optional because it's only available to that discrete subset of people. They have their own policies and rules governing requirements for use. But as a general rule of thumb, discretely documenting adverse events within HealthLink is considered optional. We do have some teams I know who are also documenting this type of information in research notes, including grading and attribution in study-specific SMART phrases that they might be using. That is also considered optional documentation to put in HealthLink as well. And if you are doing that, I would recommend you put it in a research note. All right, last kind of should I, shouldn't I, what can I not do is the prohibited documentation in HealthLink. You will find that this is a very short list, but it is an important list. And these items are called out in various locations in that documentation guideline, but there is some information that you should not put in HealthLink related to research studies. So the first thing up on here is Anne touched on earlier. So when Anne was talking about lab results or test results that are clinically relevant. She made a comment that it has to be from a CLIA certified lab or an FDA approved device. So test results that are not from CLIA certified labs, we do not want them in HealthLink because we do not want them getting used incidentally for clinical decisions for the patient. Anne talked about what CLIA was, but basically it's the certification service that says, yep, this lab is okay to perform these tests, and you can use those and trust those results. If a testing location isn't CLIA certified and you get results back from them, please do not put those results in HealthLink. There's a small caveat down here at the bottom. There are some tests that can be performed underneath a CLIA waiver. Those test results may be entered in like a progress note within HealthLink. I think one of the most common situations this comes up is a urine pregnancy test. So if your team is running urine pregnancy tests for your patients under a CLIA certificate of waiver, you can enter that result into HealthLink in a progress note or similar. But if you're sending labs out to a central lab location, they're doing testing, they're not CLIA certified, don't put it in HealthLink. Along similar lines is the next one, investigational procedure results that are not FDA approved. Again, just like with those lab results, we don't want these being used for clinical decisions because they haven't been FDA approved for diagnosis. Some examples where this comes up is imaging with an investigational isotope. So it's good that you would put in something in HealthLink that say this patient underwent a scan, an MRI with contrast, or they underwent a CT scan using XYZ investigational isotope, but we don't want you to put in the results of the procedure into HealthLink because it is investigational. Same thing would go if you're doing some monitoring with an investigational device. The example I have up here is if you're doing heart monitoring with an investigational Holter monitor or other kind of cardiac monitor. If that device is not FDA approved for diagnosis, do not put the results in HealthLink. Unblinding information is one I think that comes up fairly frequently. We have developed a education document about this specifically because we want to encourage you that just because the study is blinded does not mean you shouldn't be documenting things in HealthLink. What we really want to keep out of HealthLink is just that information that could potentially unblind the participant or unblind other staff members who should be blinded to what the patient's treatment assignment is. All documentation that goes into HealthLink for blinded studies should be put in a blinded format. It feels weird to put that in past tense. And we give some examples in the document that's linked out here. But one of the most common ones is if the study involves a blinded investigational study drug. We want you to document in HealthLink that the patient got that drug. And the way we do so is standardized so that you would say, this is study drug / placebo. And what that means is that it's not going to show the patient or the administering staff what drug the patient actually received, but it is going to communicate that there is a potential they received this active drug or placebo at this time. The dose may or may not be included depending on how blinded the study is or how complicated those requirements are. But we just want to make sure that because this could seriously have an impact on the patient's care, the information is documented in HealthLink. We want to balance that with the need of the research study to maintain the blinding of both the patient and staff members. And so if you're running into situations like this and you're not sure how much information should be in HealthLink, please let us know. We're happy to help out with these questions or help direct them. The other thing I want to touch on, which is also discussed in that document linked on this slide, is that there are very limited situations in which documenting blinded information in the electronic health record, or unblinded information rather, is unavoidable. An example that we've run into with this is intraoperative notes. There are times when during an operation, they are required to document exactly what happened and what occurred, what device was used, etc., in a note or a procedure note. In those situations, we have mechanisms by which we can withhold that information from being shared to the patient. And reach out to us. We're happy to talk you through how to use them. Their mechanisms to withhold from MyChart are pretty simple, and we can talk you through those as well. There are also mechanisms, if there are extreme concerns, by which we can withhold that information from release of information requests coming from the patient as well. So if the patient were to request a copy of their entire electronic health record, we can withhold that information from them, provided the patient has consented to have that information withheld in their informed consent form or HIPAA authorization form, which again is discussed in this linked document. So if you have any questions about blinded and unblinded study documentation, please just reach out to us. We're happy to help you. It gets a little complicated, we understand. So the next one is stigmatizing information. And the reason we want to keep stigmatizing information out of the electronic health record is to prevent discrimination against the patient. We have a guideline document written up for this, which goes through specific exceptions to these documentation requirements that we've just gone through that are specific to stigmatizing studies in order to prevent that discrimination for the patient. When we're talking about discrimination in this situation, we're really talking about risks to the patient's insurability, their employability. We're not talking about things that are about studies, which might be of an embarrassing nature to the patient. We're not talking about kind of like a psychological risk to the patient. We're really talking about those concrete risks of if the patient's insurance company finds this out, they could lose their health insurance or they could lose their life insurance. The document goes into details on how that determination is made and what exceptions to the documentation requirements are. The biggest exception to the documentation requirements, if your entire study is determined to be stigmatizing, is that we do not have you scan in the consent form or include the actual title or the actual or potential diagnoses for the patient. We don't have you include any diagnostic tests that would indicate the diagnosis in documentation, in any test results. We have ways of, again, kind of blinding that information as we're putting it into the electronic health record. And we encourage the use of very generic terms for these patients, such as research study patient. Again, the reason for this is really to protect the patient from discrimination. And so if you have any questions about whether or not your study would fall under this, I would really encourage you to talk to your principal investigator, who would be ultimately responsible for making the decision of if the study is stigmatizing. And you can also, we're happy to consult with you too, but it might be better for you to reach out to the IRB with specific questions as well. Along those same lines, we do not want you to scan into HealthLink separate genetic research or tissue banking consents. The reason for this, again, is to prevent that discrimination to the patient. We make a very clear distinction here between consent forms that include that information in the main body of the consent form and consent forms that include that information in a separate consent form. If it is included in the main body of the consent form, we still want you to scan that consent into HealthLink. And the reason is the historical decision was made that it's not necessarily buried in the main consent form, but it's much less likely that somebody is going to go reading through each page of a scanned in main consent form to find tissue banking information versus a separate genetic research or tissue banking consent that says right at the top of the document, tissue banking consent. It would be much more clear to anybody who is perhaps not doing what they were supposed to be doing in the electronic health record that then that patient had consented for tissue banking or genetic research. So for that reason, if it's a separate consent, Does not have to be scanned into HealthLink. We don't want it in HealthLink. If it's included in the main consent, please get that scanned in. All right, bonus. Going to do less than 10 minutes here. Cures Act final rule. So if you attended our HealthLink user group meeting last month, you got a lot more of this information. This is the speed version. This is the abridged version. All right, we're going to go fast. We're going to go furious and go. All right, so this is a gross oversimplification of what the Cures Act, the 21st Century Cures Act and Cures Act final rule means. As far as the impact to what we're discussing today, it means that there is a legal requirement to share information with patients from their electronic health record. What that means about HealthLink documentation is that UW Health must provide patients with access to that health information via electronic means in a timely and efficient manner. The way in which we do so is through the patient portal connected with HealthLink/Epic, which is MyChart. Next slide. So what needs to be shared with patients? Earlier on, we talked about how everything that's documented in HealthLink is part of the electronic health record. The two things in the blue box here are what is required to be shared with patients. The designated record set, which is health information and billing information in the electronic health record, and then the legal medical record, which is just that health information. So you see electronic health record, designated record set, legal medical record. It's all a subset of the same thing. So in that information that is included with patients is any documentation that is done by clinical research users that would otherwise be shared with the patient. So the vast majority of documentation that is done for clinical research is done using standard clinical tools within HealthLink. Examples of this are vital signs, progress note, medication list, medication administration, procedure documentation. Anything that is done using those standard clinical tools is going to follow the decisions for sharing that were made for those standard clinical tools. And in the vast majority of those situations, the decision has been made that it's part of the legal medical record and patients have a right to see it in their patient portal or MyChart. So it's going to go to them. Research-specific documentation tools, we have gone through and spelled out exactly which of these are part of the legal medical record and designated record set, which means they have to be shared with patients in MyChart. You'll see this is actually a pretty short list of research-specific documentation tools because, like I said, everything else is done using those standard clinical tools that will follow the decisions made for those tools. So tests resulted at outside labs, investigational procedure results, again, both of those must be CLIA certified, labs or FDA approved for diagnosis devices in order to be included in HealthLink. But if they are, they're considered part of the legal medical record, part of the designated record set, and therefore they can be shared with patients via MyChart. Research encounters. Because the purpose of a research encounter at its core is to document clinically relevant information for patients that takes place outside of a clinical encounter, those were determined to be part of the legal medical record and designated record set, and therefore information from research encounters will be shared with patients in MyChart. I'm going to skip research-informed consent for a moment because that one gets a little complicated. Research notes, as discussed up above, optional documentation should not contain or should not be the sole source of clinically relevant information in the patient's electronic health record. So mainly these are just containing research information. They are not part of the legal medical record. They are not part of the designated record set. They will not be shared with patients in MyChart. This includes regardless of what type of encounter they were written under. So if you're writing a research note in an office visit, an inpatient encounter, a research encounter, a procedure visit, it doesn't matter. Even if everything else from that encounter is shared with MyChart, the research note itself is not going to be shared with the patient in MyChart. Adverse event activity documentation. So this is documentation done in the discrete activity we talked about that only Cancer Center currently has access to. It is not part of the legal medical record. It is not part of the designated record set. It does not get shared with patients in MyChart. Finally, I want to give a specific call out to clinical research unit flow sheets, which if you are a user of the clinical research unit services, you know that they scan those into HealthLink. That has its own document type. It has been determined to not be part of the legal medical record. It's not part of the designated record set, and therefore it is not shared with patients in my chart. I'm going to bump back up now and talk about that research informed consent, because you'll see it's the one thing that does not have consistent markings here. So the research informed consent has been determined to not be part of the legal medical record, nor is it part of the designated record set. It is, however, shared with patients in my chart. And the reason for this is UW Health as a whole has kind of a larger philosophy that if the patient's signing consent for something, they should have access to that consent form to know what they signed. I think you would all agree that you would like your patients to have access to their informed consent forms as well. So these documents, since they have been viewed by, signed by the patient, they will be shared with patients in my chart. That information will be readily available for them should they need to reference it later on, which frankly, I think is a good thing, because if you're like me and you sign a research informed consent, as soon as you get home, it might go into the recycling bin. I'm not going to say that I've done that, but now I know that if I need to, I can find it in my chart. All right, that was Cures Act in less than 10 minutes. I know that was a lot of information. Please reach out if you have questions about any of that. But now we have some time for general questions from you guys about any of the information we just presented. So again, unfortunately, I think our chat is down, but please feel free to speak up and we would be happy to address it if we can.
Thanks so much, Ann and Carla. I really appreciate it. It is a lot of information, and please, people, don't be shy. We won't ask you to put your camera on, but feel free to ask them questions.
Hey, Ann and Carla, this is Travis over in Research Compliance. I have a quick question about getting access to these links and pages, because we don't have UConnect access. I know a lot of the times people we're working with would have access to them, but like I can't even send links to. So I don't know if there's good search terms or if things are just going to be made public eventually, but that's my question.
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up. That not all of our users maybe can get there on UConnect. We assume that most of our users who are, if you have access to HealthLink, you by default have access to UConnect. Our boss is Betsy Nugent, and she has talked about potentially moving these resources more to like the clinical research office site instead, so they would be more widely available to the campus community. So that has something we've begun to talk about. But if you'd like to meet with us, so we can show you what we've got, and then can share whichever PDFs would be pertinent to your group, we'd be happy to work with you on that for now, until that final decision is made as to whether or not some or all of the documents should be housed elsewhere for the sake of access. Carla, do you have anything to add?
I was going to say the same thing. We're happy to send you anything that you're not able to access. Even if you just have a vague question of, hey, do you guys have any documents about this? We can send you the PDF for now. But yeah, there has been discussion, like Ann said, about moving it to a more UW-Madison centrally located place so that you don't have to have that UConnect access to get it.
Other questions? We're not scary, and there's no dumb questions.
Hey, Ann and Carla, it's Ann Zoomhagen-Kraus.
Hey, Ann.
CRO. Hey, thanks so much for this presentation. I did have one question about the AE documentation that the cancer folks are able to use. And apologies if you mentioned this in the presentation and I missed it. Is there any timeline for the rest of us to be able to use those?
Sadly, at this time, there is not. It is largely dependent on team capacity and the ability for us to, like I said, build those term sets for other studies. And at this time, our team capacity is, we're a little slim pickings right now.
I would also say there is an evaluation going on in terms of how it's going for the Cancer Center. So I think that is also part of it as well, just having that underway to evaluate where there's still, sticky points, or we've done some hacking to the activity to give the Cancer Center what they needed, and we've been working with Epic to improve the activity to make sure it has the components that are really going to be helpful to research teams. So I think all of those things together, it's definitely on the roadmap, but yeah, not just yet for the broader community.
Okay, thanks, you two.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna Carla. This is Andrea from the PCRC group. And I just have a question about adding medications to the MAR. So did that change at some point? Were we able to do that in the past?
To my knowledge, no. Research coordinators have never had security to document on the MAR.
Okay, or maybe it wasn't the MAR necessarily, but I remember entering medications into the patient's chart. And so was that something different than the MAR?
You might be thinking of the medication list, which is just a list of medications the patient is currently taking.
Okay.
That research coordinators can still document on and should to add study medications as needed.
Got it. Okay, that's, I guess, where I'm getting confused then. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we've got 1 more minute, so we might want to advance to our next slide in case anyone has any questions other than right now. So most of the resources we talked about can be found on this Research and HealthLink page on UConnect. Like Anne said, if you're on UConnect and you search research, we're still the first hit. We have recently are having a temporary change in our communication strategy. If you had previously been contacting us at our shared email, crps@uwhealth.org, please cease to do so for the time being. Again, due to our team capacity and some structuring changes happening right now, we are temporarily deactivating that email. If you send an email to it, you will get an automatic bounce back with instructions on who to contact instead. But you can email Anne and myself directly. Otherwise, feel free to submit a ServiceNow request if you need us. That's another great way to get us.
All right, I just want to thank Anne and Carla. I'm always humbled by how much you two know and manage. So thank you. And thank you to all who were able to join us today. All registrants will receive an email recording of today's session and the presentation slides. And the email will include a link to a survey. And we really do appreciate your feedback. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our newsletter by visiting the website uwclinicaltrials.org. And we will also include that link in a follow-up email. And finally, please stay tuned for information about our November session, which will be focused on theranostics, which is a combination of therapeutics and diagnostics and very exciting advancements in the future of cancer treatment. So thank you all again for joining us today. And thank you, Anne and Carla.